Dawn mist lifted as landing craft slammed against Omaha's surf. From the gray haze rolled columns of Sherman tanks, waves slapping their hulls, engines growling as they clawed toward shore. German defenders on the bluffs, who once dismissed these toys, now shouted into radios, "Endless armor coming!" Crews scrambled their 88s, realizing too late that they faced not a handful of machines, but a tide forged in Detroit. Many Shermans swamped offshore, especially at Omaha, yet survivors were decisive in smashing beach defenses and opening the exits. "Nothing but a gasoline lighter, one hit and it burns," sneered a German Panzer officer in a 1942 journal entry. The remark captured the early contempt German armor specialists held for America's new tank, the M4 Sherman. Its silhouette was tall and slab-sided, its armor flat, its engine gasoline-fed rather than diesel. To German eyes, schooled in engineering pride and the doctrine of blitzkrieg, the Sherman looked like a poorly designed toy, destined to light up the battlefield like a match. By the spring of 1942, German intelligence had begun compiling captured photographs and evaluation reports of the Sherman. They were unimpressed. At Krupp's proving ground, armored engineers ran through the figures with disdain. Frontal armor at first only 50 millimeters, vulnerable to nearly every German anti-tank gun in service. A 75-millimeter gun of modest velocity compared to the deadly 75mm K-Quat 42 mounted on the Panther, and a gasoline engine that, they believed, turned the crew compartment into a tinderbox. For officers accustomed to the prestige of Tigers and the promise of the coming Panther, this American machine was a mediocrity. But across the Atlantic, a very different mindset drove the Sherman's creation. In 1940, William Knudsen, a former automobile executive plucked by President Roosevelt to serve as America's industry czar, insisted that mass production was the real weapon the United States could bring to the fight. Tanks would not be crafted like bespoke automobiles or artisanal weapons. They would be stamped, welded, and rolled off assembly lines like Fords and Chevrolets. Knudsen's philosophy shaped the M4's design. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, U.S. Ordnance officers tested early prototypes. Reports acknowledged weaknesses, armor that struggled against heavy German guns, mobility that was adequate but not exceptional. Yet the same reports emphasized virtues often invisible to the German critics: simplicity of parts, interchangeability, and room for upgrades. The Sherman was built to be produced fast, maintained in the field by mechanics with basic training, and adapted to new roles. It was not meant to dominate a battlefield alone. It was meant to arrive by the hundreds. General George S. Patton, who had commanded early armored maneuvers, understood this. He once remarked to staff that quantity had a quality of its own. In North Africa and later in Europe, he would throw Shermans forward in relentless waves, knowing that even if a Panther or Tiger outgunned one tank, the Germans could not hope to match the replacements flowing from America's factories. The numerical contrasts were staggering. By the war's end, nearly 49,234 Shermans had rolled off U.S. production lines. Each one cost roughly $33,000, 0 cents, to build. A German Tiger cost on the order of 250,000, 300,000 Reichsmarks in wartime resources, versus roughly $33,000, 0 cents per Sherman, a broad order of magnitude contrast in resource intensity. The currencies are not directly comparable. Tigers were masterpieces of engineering, but like masterpieces, they were slow to produce and costly to maintain. Every time a Tiger broke down, it required long repairs, often deep behind the lines. A Sherman could be patched in a forward depot within hours and returned to combat the next day. German officers rarely saw these numbers on paper. In 1942, their focus was on the battlefield specifications, and by those metrics they saw the Sherman as fatally flawed. The Tiger's famous 88-meter Q8K-36 could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at over 1,000 meters, a lethal advantage. Reports circulated that once the big guns were in range, the American tanks would have no chance. Yet these conclusions ignored the very logic of the Sherman's design. It was not a duelist, it was an army's workhorse. Troop memoranda from 1942 reveal the tone of German evaluations. They noted the Sherman as slab-sided, primitive, and easily penetrated. Some officers went further, joking that the Americans had sent their soldiers into battle in ovens. The arrogance was real, and it fed a dangerous underestimation. The irony was profound. What Germans dismissed as crude was precisely what made the Sherman devastating. Its gasoline engine, while flammable, could be repaired quickly and manufactured in huge numbers. Its flat armor was not elegant, but it was sufficient when multiplied by the hundreds. Its silhouette was tall, but that same height gave the crew more space, better visibility, and, importantly, comfort during long campaigns. German tankers crouched in cramped interiors, while Sherman crews fought with room to breathe and work. For American planners, the Sherman was never meant to be invulnerable. It was meant to be available in Tunisia, in Sicily, in Normandy, in the Ardennes. When one burned, another would take its place, and then another, until German lines cracked, not under individual duels, but under relentless mass. The Tiger may have been a masterpiece, but war is not an art gallery. War is logistics, tonnage, and replacement. For every Tiger that rumbled onto the battlefield, 10 Shermans were already waiting, and 10 more were on the trains from Detroit. Even in 1942, as German officers laughed at Detroit steel, some voices within their ranks warned of the danger. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, wrote privately that American industry could not be dismissed. He understood that the battlefield was not only where shells flew, but where factories decided the tempo. Yet his warnings were drowned in the arrogance of those who believed German engineering alone would decide the war. The American ordnance reports at Aberdeen ended on a different note. The Sherman was adequate in protection, adaptable in firepower, and designed for production. Those words, dry in bureaucratic tone, proved prophetic. The Germans would discover that adequacy, multiplied tens of thousands of times, was more terrifying than any technical brilliance. The mockery of 1942, written in journals and whispered in officer messes, would echo bitterly 2 years later. By then, German soldiers would not laugh at the gasoline lighter. They would face entire armored battalions of them, roaring forward across beaches, deserts, and forests, overwhelming by sheer presence. What looked like weakness was strength in disguise. At peak, Ford's Willow Run turned out B-24 Liberators in roughly 1 per hour. U.S. Shermans came from a nationwide network led by Detroit Tank Arsenal, Chrysler, Fisher Body, Pressed Steel Car, Alco, Baldwin Pullman Standard, Lima, Pacific Car and Foundry, and Ford's Highland Park Tank Arsenal. Across the Atlantic, at Cassell or Henschel's workshops, a Tiger tank could take weeks to assemble, sometimes longer if parts ran short. The contrast was stark. Germany produced weapons as though each were a cathedral. America produced them as if they were automobiles or loaves of bread. The factory that embodied this difference rose from farmland west of Detroit. Conceived in 1940 and breaking ground in 1941, Willow Run was designed by architect Albert Kahn, the industrial designer behind many of Ford's plants. Covering 3.5 million square feet, it was then the largest factory under a single roof in the world. From above, its mile-long assembly line resembled a metallic river inside. Up to 42,000 workers at peak. Men and women, migrants from Appalachia and the rural South, and tens of thousands of new industrial laborers, riveted, welded, and assembled under round-the-clock shifts. Charles E. Sorensen, Ford's legendary production manager known as Cast Iron Charlie, oversaw the transformation of automaking into war-making. He believed that tanks and aircraft could be built like Model Ts, standardized, modular, and produced by the thousands. To European eyes, this sounded unmilitary. Tanks, in the German conception, were bespoke instruments of national pride, hand-fitted by skilled machinists. But Sorensen, following William Knudsen's mobilization strategy, insisted that the future of war lay in interchangeable parts, simplified processes, and assembly line throughput. At first, Willow Run faltered. In 1942, bottlenecks plagued the new line. Shortages of gearboxes and armor plate caused delays. Inexperienced labor and rushed training produced quality control failures. Many of the early vehicles rolled off incomplete, requiring rework before shipment. Critics of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy seized on these problems, claiming the factory was a political showcase, not a functional arsenal. Yet the problems proved temporary. By late 1942, and especially in 1943, ordnance logs show nationwide Sherman output climbing to 2,000 per month, 1943-44, driven by Detroit tank arsenal and multiple private contractors. Willow Run symbolized assembly line war production, but built B-24s, not tanks. Nationwide, U.S. tank production peaked at around 2,000 Shermans monthly across a network of plants. Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler. The Colt Compound in Keochi, Nomeo. Pullman Standard, American Locomotive. Baldwin Locomotive, Fisher Body, Pressed Steel Car, and more. Willow Run became a symbol, but it was only one gear in a vast industrial engine. The scale dwarfed German efforts. At their best, German plants produced under 100 Tigers in a month, and Panthers never exceeded roughly 380 per month at peak in 1944. By contrast, U.S. tank factories combined produced over 2,000 Shermans in a typical month in 1943-44. Where German tanks were individually formidable, American tanks arrived in fleets. A typical Detroit tank arsenal day followed an industrial rhythm. Morning, hull sections aligned on moving carriers. Midday, armor plates bolted, turrets installed. Afternoon, engines lowered, wiring connected, radios tested. Evening, completed Shermans rolled to the proving ground, while Willow Run's mile-long line did the same for B-24 bombers. What once took weeks in German workshops could now be done in under 24 hours. The resilience of the system mattered as much as output. When Allied bombers hit German tank plants at Kassel or Nuremberg, recovery often required weeks or months. America's production, by contrast, was geographically dispersed. Even if one plant slowed, others absorbed the slack. Willow Run was enormous, but it was part of a decentralized web. That redundancy ensured continuity the Germans could not disrupt. Edsel Ford, already in poor health, still lent his name and presence to the project. His speeches framed Willow Run not merely as a Ford Motor venture, but as a test of democracy's industrial will. "The machines we build today," he said, "will decide whether free men can continue to build tomorrow." For the workers, many new to industrial life, many women replacing men sent to the front, it was a statement of purpose. German intelligence failed to grasp the cultural and strategic meaning of this experiment. Their 1941-42 assessments assumed the American automobile industry could not convert to heavy war production. Reports noted the early problems at Willow Run and predicted systemic failure. But by 1943, those reports were obsolete. Captured German memoranda from 1944 revealed the alarm. Enemy tank production exceeds destruction rate. Replacements arrive faster than they can be destroyed. The irony was complete. German officers who had laughed in 1942 at the thought of civilian factories producing military weapons now faced battalions of Shermans equipped entirely from Detroit's forges. The tanks did not arrive singly. They came in waves. If one burned, another followed. If 5 were destroyed, 5 more rolled forward. The lesson was brutal but decisive. War was no longer won by craftsmanship alone. It was won by throughput, logistics, and the ability to replace. Tigers and Panthers were masterpieces, but their very complexity guaranteed scarcity. The Sherman was adequate, but adequacy, multiplied 49,000 times, became supremacy. Willow Run's story also revealed America's transformation. It was not just steel and machines, but a mobilization of society. Women, African Americans, migrants from poor farms, all poured into the factory. The culture of consumer production fused with wartime urgency. Every rivet hammered into a Sherman was a declaration. America would not only fight with soldiers, but with factories. By late 1943, even the most skeptical generals admitted what Sorensen and Knudsen had argued. The M4 Sherman was never designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to be present. In Tunisia, in Sicily, on Omaha Beach, in the Ardennes, Willow Run made that presence real. German officers never forgave themselves for underestimating it. In 1942, they mocked the Sherman's silhouette, its gasoline engine, its supposedly crude armor. By 1944, those same officers were reporting with dread endless columns of American armor. What they had dismissed as clumsy had become the steel tide that rolled them backward across Europe. The state's head warrant, heat shimmered over Libya as columns of Shermans clanked forward, sand grinding in their treads. The desert sun bleached their olive paint into a dusty gray, while plumes of exhaust hung low in the still air. Ahead lay German positions of the Afrika Korps, dug into ridges and wadis, their long-barreled Panzers waiting like predators. It was the Sherman's first trial by fire. When the M4S arrived in North Africa in late 1942, they entered a battlefield already shaped by German reputation. Rommel's Afrika Korps had built an aura of invincibility with daring maneuvers and tactical brilliance. British Crusaders and American Stuarts had fared poorly against German Panzer II's and 4V's. Many Allied soldiers doubted whether American factories could deliver anything sturdier. The Sherman's arrival changed the tone. Standing taller than most tanks in theater, with a powerful 75 mm gun mounted in a roomy turret, it looked imposing beside the lighter British machines. Crews praised its speed on hard ground, 25 to 30 miles per hour, and its ability to traverse long desert hauls without constant breakdowns. Yet they also knew its limits. The 75 gun could penetrate about 75 to 90 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, enough to handle older Panzer II's but less reliable against upgraded Panzer IV's. Against a Tiger, which first appeared in Tunisia in late 1942, it was outmatched. Forensic traces of the Sherman's baptism survive in after-action reports from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, which entered Tunisia in 1943. One summarized engagement noted, "Sherman tanks performed adequately in maneuver and fire. Losses occurred at expected ranges when enemy heavy guns engaged. Tactical coordination remains decisive factor. Dry words, but behind them lay fire and chaos." German Panzer Regiment 5 of the Afrika Korps described the Americans with disdain at first. Their diary entries mocked the Shermans as tall targets easily sighted. Yet by the spring of 1943, the same diaries carried a different tone. German crews admitted frustration at facing not just isolated enemy tanks, but entire battalions. Where they destroyed 10, 20 more appeared. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 offered a brutal lesson. American forces under General Lloyd Fredendall suffered heavy losses, many Shermans knocked out by German ambushes. Rommel maneuvered his panzers with deadly precision, exploiting inexperience and poor coordination. For the Germans, the battle confirmed their scorn. The Sherman was no match tactically. But for the Americans, Kasserine became a wake-up call. Eisenhower replaced commanders, restructured command systems, and drilled units in combined arms tactics. Within months, the same Shermans returned, under sharper leadership. The Sheriff's Office doctrine implicated that classroom training courses would not do the trick. The logistical story was as telling as the tactical one. Supplying tanks across more than 200 miles of desert roads tested both armies. German fuel lines stretched back across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to Allied bombing. American Shermans, though thirsty for gasoline, could be refueled and repaired in forward depots. Spare parts arrived in crates marked from Detroit or Pittsburgh. By mid-1943, mechanics learned to replace engines and gearboxes in hours. German Panzers, by contrast, often languished waiting for specialized components shipped from Europe. Numbers soon shifted the balance. In Tunisia, Shermans often outnumbered German tanks 3-1. At battles like El Guitar in March 1943, U.S. armored divisions pushed back against veteran Panzer units. German reports noted killing multiple Shermans per engagement, yet could not ignore the steady accumulation of American armor. The arithmetic was grinding down the vaunted Afrika Korps. Rommel himself in later memoirs conceded the point. Quantity triumphed where quality alone could not. His Tiger tanks, terrifying when they appeared, were too few to decide the campaign. Shermans might burn when hit, but there were always more to replace them. The Sherman's reputation for catching fire became a dark joke among crews. German soldiers called them Tommy Cookers, while rumors spread that the Americans nicknamed their own tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter advertised to light every time. The myth carried weight in mess halls and letters home, yet the reality was more complex. The gasoline engine did make early Shermans vulnerable, but post-1944 models introduced wet ammunition stowage, storing shells in water-jacketed racks that drastically reduced fires. In Tunisia, however, crews faced the earlier versions, and the fear of flame haunted them. Contrast defined every encounter. A single Panzer IV could sometimes knock out multiple Shermans in a duel, its long-barreled guns superior at range. But duels were not the measure of campaigns. By the time a German crew disabled a Sherman, another was already maneuvering to flank. American doctrine emphasized combined arms. Tanks advancing with artillery, infantry, and air support, Shermans were pieces of a larger system, not solitary champions. Forensic glimpses from German side highlight the psychological shift. A captured officer's interrogation report in 1943 noted, "American tanks are inferior, singly, but their numbers and artillery support cause severe difficulties. Our losses mount when breakthroughs occur, even if initial duels are in our favor." This recognition marked the slow erosion of German confidence. The irony grew sharper with every mile of desert. Rommel's tactical brilliance, which had dazzled Europe, began to falter against an opponent that could afford to lose and return the next day. American divisions learned faster than expected. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered en masse. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops taken prisoner. Among the trophies stood rows of Shermans, dusty and scarred but still operational. For the Americans, the baptism of fire had cost blood and metal, but it proved the Sherman's role. It was not invulnerable, not elegant, not fearsome in the way a Tiger was, but it was enough, and enough was everything when multiplied by thousands. The mockery of German officers in 1942, calling the Sherman a gasoline lighter, had met its first contradiction. In the North African sun, the so-called toy tank had shown it could fight, bleed, and still return. What the Germans saw as a weakness, replaceability, was precisely its strength. The desert campaign closed with a lesson etched into every commander's mind. The Sherman was not a duelist's blade. It was a hammer, and in war, hammers break more than swords. Omaha surf swallowed Sherman DD tanks as waves battered their canvas skirts. Crews fought to keep flotation screens upright, while salt water poured into their hulls. Engines coughed, propellers churned, and then, one by one, tanks slipped beneath the gray water, their gun barrels vanishing like masts of ships going under. By the time infantry stormed the sand, only about 27 of roughly 64 assigned DDs at Omaha made it ashore. Many of the 740 Cirques DDs swamped when launched too far offshore, while 743rds landed more directly. June 6, 1944, was not merely the largest amphibious landing in history, it was also the Shermans' most audacious gamble. American planners had fitted duplex drive, DE, Shermans with canvas flotation gear, believing they could swim ashore alongside landing craft and offer immediate firepower. At Juneau and Gold Beaches, the gamble paid off. Dozens rumbled out of the surf, firing as they advanced, but at Omaha, rough seas turned innovation into disaster. Tank after tank swamped, dragging crews to their deaths before they could even fire a shot. For the men on Omaha's sand, this failure could have been fatal. German defenders from the 352nd Infantry Division held fortified positions along the bluffs, backed by artillery and machine guns. Their reports described the shock of seeing tanks emerge from the haze. Endless columns of steel advancing, fire upon them at all costs. The German 88s, concealed in hedgerows and bunkers, barked at the advancing armor. Yet the Shermans that survived changed the equation. As the 741st Tank Battalion clawed up from the beach, they became moving fortresses for pinned-down infantry. Their 75mm guns blasted pillboxes at point-blank range, while their treads crushed wire and obstacles that had stalled soldiers. In after-action reports, infantry officers credited tanks with breaking open exits from the beach. Where armor reached us, men moved forward. Where it did not, they lay pinned. Numbers again told the story. By nightfall on June 6, nearly 1,200 Allied tanks had landed across all beaches. At Omaha, losses were catastrophic, but at Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword armor arrived in force. Where German commanders had at most 50 Panzers within range of the invasion beaches, the Allies landed entire battalions in a single day. Artillery added weight to the tide. American guns fired over 13,000 shells per hour in the first stages of the breakout, pulverizing strong points that tanks could then overrun. The synergy of artillery and armor created a rhythm. Bombardment, advance, bombardment again. German defenders, who had scoffed at the mediocre Shermans in 1942, now faced them by the hundred, each backed by firepower that dwarfed anything they could muster. General Omar Bradley, overseeing the Omaha landings, admitted the near disaster of the DD tanks, but he also emphasized their psychological effect. When they appeared on the beach, our men knew they had a chance. Major General Leonard Giroux, commanding V Corps, noted the same. The mere presence of tanks boosted morale for infantry under murderous fire. On the German side, General Erich Marx, responsible for coastal defense, sent frantic dispatches that morning. Continuous landing of armored vehicles, impossible to contain with present forces. His units had prepared for infantry, but the sight of tanks pouring off landing craft in wave after wave broke confidence. The contrast between Omaha and the other beaches underscored the Allies' advantage. Where armor was absent, men died in droves. Where armor was present, defenses cracked. At Gold and Juneau, British and Canadian Shermans rolled directly off landing craft, bypassing the surf, and stormed into villages within hours. German defenders collapsed faster, not because the Shermans were invulnerable, but because they were numerous, reliable, and always advancing. Caution is necessary. Popular accounts often paint D-Day as a flawless triumph of American and British planning. In truth, it teetered on catastrophe at Omaha. But even with disastrous D-Day tank losses, the sheer weight of Allied armor still forced a breach. The myth of the Shermans' mediocrity again collided with reality. No individual tank was decisive, but battalions of them altered the course of the invasion. Forensic records from the 741st Tank Battalion highlight the chaos. Logs note, seas too rough, 50% swamped before reaching shore. Survivors provided critical fire support at exits E1 and D3. Those survivors saved lives by smashing bunkers that otherwise would have slaughtered more infantry. The German perspective reveals equal parts awe and despair. Coastal reports referred to a tide of armor that could not be checked. Soldiers who had once derided the Shermans' silhouette as a barn on tracks now faced barns backed by artillery, airstrikes, and endless reinforcements. For them, the sight was not comical, but overwhelming. The irony was stark. The very traits the Germans despised, the Sherman's ordinariness, its lack of refinement, its sheer abundance, were what stormed the Atlantic Wall. A tiger might dominate an open field, but there were no tigers at Omaha. There were Shermans, and there were hundreds of them, and they kept coming, even when the sea itself claimed half their number. By the evening of June 6th, Allied forces had secured precarious footholds across Normandy. The beaches were littered with burned hulls, drowned tanks still visible in the surf, and Sherman turrets blackened by German shells. Yet behind the wrecks came more. Within days, ports funneled thousands of vehicles into the lodgment. By the end of June, several thousand Allied tanks, on the order of tilde 2,000, 3,500, were ashore in Normandy, with total armored vehicles far higher. German prisoners captured that week expressed disbelief at the scale. One infantry sergeant told interrogators, "We thought you had few machines, but they came and came, like a factory without end." He was right. Willow Run and Detroit had been working for this moment for 3 years. The role of the Sherman in Overlord was not glamorous. Many drowned, many burned, crews died trapped inside, their tanks smoking pyres on the beach. But without them, infantry would have bled even more heavily, and the Atlantic Wall might have held. Their mediocrity was irrelevant. Their presence was everything. In the final assessment, D-Day showed what North Africa had foreshadowed. Tanks did not have to be invincible to be decisive. They only had to be there in numbers the enemy could not match. And on June 6, 1944, the Sherman's flood proved irresistible. "It took 5 hours to kill one of theirs," recalled a U.S. tanker years later, describing the duels between Shermans and Germany's new Panther tanks in Normandy. The memory captured a bitter truth. By mid-1944, the Sherman was no longer facing Panzer II's or IV's. It was up against Hitler's latest super tank, designed explicitly to restore German dominance. The Panther, Panzerkampfwagen V, entered combat in 1943 at Kursk. Nearly 200 rolled into the largest tank battle in history, meant to spearhead the Wehrmacht's offensive. On paper, they were terrifying. A long-barreled 75 mm/70 gun, capable of piercing Sherman armor at 1,500 meters, sloped frontal plating up to 80 m thick, and a low, sleek profile that contrasted with the Sherman's tall, boxy frame, but reality undercut the myth. At Kursk, over 150 Panthers broke down or caught fire within days, crippled by rushed production and mechanical failures. By Normandy the following summer, many of those flaws had been corrected. The Panther had become the standard-bearer of German armor, more numerous than the Tiger and nearly as deadly. The Sherman, even in its improved 76 mm version, was overmatched in head-to-head duels. U.S. reports from July 1944 noted the sobering fact: Sherman's 76 mm gun effective only under 800 meters against Panther frontal armor. Penetration possible at flanks and rear. American tankers learned the lesson in blood. Ambushes in the bocage Normandies, dense hedgerows allowed Panthers to lurk and strike at long range. Sherman after Sherman brewed up, crews scrambling from hatches as fire consumed their vehicles. In some engagements, 2 or 3 Shermans were lost for every Panther destroyed. German gunners, veterans of years of combat, recorded the satisfaction of knocking out multiple Allied tanks before retreating to cover. Yet the story did not end with the duel. War was not fought by champions in an arena. It was fought by armies, and armies lived by numbers, logistics, and repair. While a Panther could dominate a battlefield, it could not dominate a campaign. The U.S. 4th Armored Division, for example, advanced through Normandy with entire battalions of Shermans. When a tank was knocked out, replacements were available within days. Field depots had engines, transmissions, and guns stacked in rows, ready to be swapped. Mechanics worked under canvas tents, patching hulls and welding armor. A Sherman crippled one day might rejoin the fight the next. For the Panther, repairs often required withdrawal deep behind German lines, with parts scarce and factories under constant bombardment. General Omar Bradley admitted frustration with the Sherman's shortcomings. He pressed for the deployment of the heavier M26 Pershing, but production delays kept the Pershing from arriving until early 1945. In the meantime, American tankers had to fight with what they had, and that meant learning to use numbers, mobility, and combined arms. Major General John S. Wood of the 4th Armored Division drilled his men to fight smart. Shermans were to avoid frontal duels when possible, instead flanking Panthers, calling artillery, or relying on close air support from P-47 Thunderbolts. When they coordinated, the odds shifted. Shermans boxed in Panthers, artillery suppressed their positions, and fighter-bombers screamed down with rockets. German diaries capture the frustration. A Panther crewman wrote in July 1944, "We destroyed several American tanks, but there are always more. Aircraft hunt us when we withdraw. We lack fuel and repairs are endless." The psychological toll of fighting an enemy that never seemed to run out of machines was as corrosive as the duels themselves. The 5-to-1 ratio, often repeated in memoirs and histories, demands caution. It reflected the feeling of many U.S. tankers who saw friends killed and tanks destroyed at alarming rates. In reality, kill ratios varied widely, depending on terrain, numbers, and support. In open fields, Panthers might destroy several Shermans before being overwhelmed. In towns or forests, where flanking was easier, Shermans sometimes scored more favorable trades. The anecdote captured the despair of crews, but not the full picture. The contrast between the two tanks was stark. The Panther was technologically superior, better gun, better armor, lower silhouette. The Sherman was simple. Reliable mechanics, roomy interior, radios that worked consistently. German tankers often fought without functional communications, while Sherman platoons coordinated through radios in every vehicle. What the Panther had in firepower, the Sherman made up in cohesion. Forensic reports from Normandy highlight this contrast. One U.S. after-action analysis concluded Sherman units sustain higher losses in duels, but compensate through speed of replacement and integration with artillery/air support. Another noted that Panthers, though deadly, were frequently abandoned due to breakdowns or lack of fuel. By August 1944, German withdrawals left dozens of intact Panthers in ditches and villages, engines failed or fuel tanks dry. The irony was bitter. Germany had invested enormous resources into building the Panther, a tank meant to terrify the enemy, and it did. U.S. tankers respected and feared it, but its very sophistication ensured scarcity. America, by contrast, had invested in a tank that was merely adequate. Adequacy, multiplied 49,000 times, proved more lethal than excellence multiplied 6,000. Enemy commanders recognized this truth. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, argued in late 1944 that Germany should focus on producing more Panzer IVs rather than chasing perfection with Panthers and Tigers. His reasoning was pragmatic. Better to have hundreds of good tanks than dozens of great ones. But by then it was too late. Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons kept German production focused on complexity. In Normandy, the duels played out daily. Shermans burning in hedgerows, Panthers knocked out by artillery or abandoned for lack of fuel, both sides tallying losses that blurred into exhaustion. But the campaign's outcome was not in doubt. Shermans could be lost by the dozen and the advance would continue. Panthers could be lost by the dozen and there were no replacements. The memory of those duels lingered. For U.S. crews, the Panther was the nightmare tank, the foe they dreaded to see. For German crews, the Sherman was the flood, less frightening in any single duel, but unstoppable as an ocean. In the end, the Panthers' brilliance became its own undoing. It proved that superiority in design could not overcome inferiority in numbers. The Sherman, mocked as crude, forced the Panther into a defensive war it could not win. 4,102 Shermans thundered eastward under Lend-Lease, painted with red stars and Cyrillic stencils. They crossed oceans and deserts, riding convoys through the Persian Gulf, over the Caucasus, and into the furnace of the Eastern Front. To German eyes it was a shocking sight, American machines fighting under Soviet banners, part of the tidal wave pressing toward Berlin. Engineers, determined to wash out the German, turned to the Japanese police department and made the Department of Wartime Terrorism. The Lend-Lease program represented one of the greatest logistical efforts of the war. Between 1942 and 1945, 4,102 Shermans were delivered to the Soviet Union, alongside thousands of trucks, aircraft, and tons of food. The tanks traveled more than 8,000 miles through the Persian Corridor, a supply route carved from ports in Iran, up through mountain passes and across Central Asia. Each Sherman that arrived bore the scars of the journey, sand in its gears, paint faded from the desert sun, but each added to the Red Army's growing steel fist. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, orchestrator of some of the Soviet Union's greatest victories, appreciated the value of numbers and logistics. For him, Shermans were not prestige weapons but workhorses, supplementing the Red Army's vast production of T-34S. The Soviets built over 50,000 T-34S during the war, but even that output could not fully replace their staggering losses. American tanks filled critical gaps, arriving in time for offensives in Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. Colonel Dmitry Loza, who commanded Sherman-equipped units in the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps, later recalled their virtues. In his memoirs, he praised the Sherman's reliability and especially its radios. "The Sherman's radio always worked," he wrote. "In the T-34, ours failed. With the Sherman, commanders could coordinate and control. That simple advantage, communication, multiplied combat effectiveness in ways German analysts often overlook." On the battlefield, the Sherman's performance in Soviet hands varied. Against German armor, its 75 mm gun was no match for Tigers or Panthers head-on. Soviet crews quickly learned to flank, to ambush, to use mobility and numbers. They relied on the same principles as their American allies: avoid duels, exploit artillery, and press forward relentlessly. The Sherman's spacious interior and more comfortable suspension also mattered. Crews endured long marches with less exhaustion, a small but real advantage when campaigns stretched across hundreds of miles. Forensic records from Soviet archives emphasized logistics. One report summarized: fuel consumption acceptable, maintenance simplified, spare parts compatible, crew satisfaction positive regarding comfort. While not glamorous, these factors mattered to an army driving tanks across endless steppe and forest. The T-34 excelled in raw combat design, sloped armor, wide tracks for mud and snow, but Shermans offered a kind of dependability that Soviet tankers appreciated, especially on long supply hauls. German commanders noticed. Reports on the Eastern Front began to mention American tanks among Soviet columns. At first they mistook them for modified T-34S, but soon recognized the tall silhouettes of Shermans advancing alongside Soviet armor. For soldiers who had mocked the toy tank in 1942, it was a bitter irony. Not only were Americans producing them in thousands, but now even their enemy's enemy was fielding them. The contrast between Soviet and American tank doctrine sharpened the irony further. The T-34 symbolized Soviet ingenuity, rugged, powerful, and produced in staggering numbers. The Sherman symbolized American industrial discipline, standardized, reliable, mass-produced. On the battlefield, they worked together, complementing each other. The T-34 often led assaults, absorbing punishment, while Shermans supported, with reliable radios and maintenance that kept units moving. Stalin himself, though notoriously sparing in praise for allies, acknowledged the importance of Lend-Lease. In a 1943 meeting, he admitted bluntly, "Without American machines, we would not have won the war." His remark encompassed trucks, locomotives, and planes, but Shermans were part of that arsenal. Soviet railways and offensives ran on American steel as much as Soviet grit. Numbers reinforced the story. While 4,102 Shermans may seem modest compared to T-34 production, they represented entire corps' worth of armor. In the climactic offensives of 1944–45, these Shermans spearheaded thrusts through Hungary, Austria, and into Czechoslovakia. Colonel Loza's unit, for example, drove Shermans straight into Vienna in April 1945. Photographs show M4A2 Shermans, red stars painted over American white, rumbling through European streets once thought safe in Hitler's Reich. Irony echoed in Berlin itself. In 1942, German officers had dismissed the Sherman as a clumsy toy. In 1945, they faced it not only under American crews on the Western Front, but also under Soviet crews in the East. The very tank they ridiculed had become part of the vice closing around the Reich. Caution is necessary when assessing battlefield performance. Soviet tankers often preferred their T-34S in heavy fighting, praising its sloped armor and mobility in snow and mud. But many acknowledged the Sherman's comfort and radios as invaluable. Loza himself summed it up best. The Sherman was not superior, but it was dependable, and in war dependability was life. By war's end, surviving Shermans in Soviet service were worn but still running. Some remained in Red Army use into the early Cold War, a testament to their durability. Their legacy in the East, though overshadowed by the iconic T-34, underscored the global reach of America's toy tank. The irony was complete. German officers had sneered at the Sherman as a second-rate machine. Instead, they found themselves facing it on two fronts: American battalions rolling through Normandy and Soviet brigades storming into Poland. The tank mocked in Berlin helped carry Soviet armies into Berlin itself. Snow swallowed tank tracks as Shermans fought ambushes in the Ardennes forests. In December 1944, the quiet woods of Belgium erupted in fire and chaos as Hitler launched his last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. For the Americans caught off guard, the first shock was not only German infantry storming through fog, but the sudden reappearance of Panzers, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers prowling the white forests. Against them rolled battalions of Shermans, engines groaning in the bitter cold, their green paint frosted white. The Ardennes offensive was designed to split Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It relied on surprise, weather, and the striking power of German armor. More than 1,000 tanks, including the fearsome King Tiger, spearheaded the attack. For many U.S. crews, the sight was terrifying. The Sherman's 76 mm gun struggled against the thick frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers, while German 88s could destroy them from well over a kilometer away. Conditions compounded the danger. Temperatures plunged to -20 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, oil thickened, and men shivered in steel hulls that turned into refrigerators. Reports from the Third Army noted that Shermans had to keep their engines running day and night just to avoid seizing up. Fuel became precious, both for warmth and mobility. In those first days, German SS units under Joachim Peiper surged forward, ambushing convoys and overrunning villages. Panthers lurked in foggy woods, firing into American columns. King Tigers, though cumbersome, dominated open ground when they appeared, their 88 mm guns knocking out Shermans in devastating duels. American crews described the helplessness of seeing shells bounce off German armor while their own tanks brewed up. Yet the same irony that had haunted the Germans since 1942 returned. The King Tiger was a marvel, but it guzzled fuel that Germany did not have. Piper's spearhead stalled not because of enemy firepower, but because his tanks ran dry. Abandoned King Tigers, too heavy to tow, sat hulking in the snow, monuments to wasted engineering. The Americans, by contrast, had logistics. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories built over 17,500 tanks, most of them Shermans. Even as units lost dozens in ambushes, replacements arrived within days. Forward depots stocked engines, gearboxes, and tracks. Crews pulled damaged tanks off roads, welded patches over holes, and sent them back into battle. What the Germans destroyed in one fight returned in the next. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous "nuts" reply to a German surrender demand at Bastogne captured the American spirit. Shermans formed the armored backbone of that defense, firing from snowy fields, their crews braving artillery and cold alike. Infantry clung to villages, artillery pounded German columns, and wherever armor could move, Shermans blunted the attacks. General George Patton's Third Army embodied the Shermans' role in the counteroffensive. In a legendary maneuver, Patton wheeled his divisions north through snow and ice, bringing entire armored columns to relieve Bastogne. His Shermans ground forward through forests and frozen roads, often at the cost of men and machines, but always moving. German units, already short of fuel and replacements, could not match the pace. Forensic reports from after the battle tell the story in numbers. Shermans outnumbered German tanks roughly 3-1 by late December. U.S. forces maintained supply levels the Germans could only dream of. While German stocks had fallen below 50,000 tons of fuel against a need of 300,000, Allied pipelines and convoys kept American tanks rolling. Enemy accounts confirmed the despair. German tankers admitted that even when they destroyed multiple Shermans, replacements flooded in. One Panther gunner wrote bitterly, "We killed 4 in the village, but the next day 8 came back. Our fuel was gone. Theirs was endless." The contrast between King Tigers and Shermans was vivid. On open ground, King Tigers were nearly invulnerable, shrugging off shells. But in the dense forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes, their bulk became a liability. Bridges collapsed under their weight, curves trapped them, and mud swallowed their tracks. Shermans, lighter and more agile, maneuvered through towns and woods where giants bogged down. Irony once more defined the campaign. Hitler had gambled everything on armored superiority, believing his heavy tanks could shock the Allies into retreat. Instead, the offensive collapsed under the same arithmetic that had haunted Germany since North Africa. Superiority in individual duels could not overcome inferiority in production, fuel, and replacements. The Sherman, still derided as a toy in some quarters, had been present everywhere, in enough numbers to blunt the blow. By January 1945, the bulge was closed. The Germans had lost over 600 tanks, many abandoned for lack of fuel or destroyed by artillery and airstrikes once the weather cleared. The Americans lost heavily too, hundreds of Shermans burned in forests and villages. But where German losses were irreplaceable, American losses were replenished. Within weeks, divisions were back at strength, rolling east toward the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge marked Germany's last offensive. For the Sherman, it was another test passed by endurance rather than brilliance. Crews suffered, many died, and the tanks themselves bore scars of fire and ice. But the machine had done its job. It was there, in numbers the enemy could not match. The irony could not have been sharper. The King Tiger, intended as a symbol of German dominance, became instead a frozen wreck in the snow. The Sherman, mocked as a gasoline lighter, kept crawling, fighting, and returning. In the Ardennes, as in North Africa and Normandy, the toy tank proved again that war favored the many over the mighty. Today, children in museums point first at the Sherman's tall silhouette, the toy tank that won the war. Its slab sides, high turret, and long gun barrel stand in hangars and open-air displays from Normandy to Moscow, from Bovington in England to Bovington's American counterparts, reminders of a machine once mocked and later immortalized. For veterans, the sight is personal. Some remember smoke, fire, and cramped interiors. Others remember relief, survival, and the knowledge that another Sherman was always there to take the place of the one lost. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built 49,234 Shermans. It was a number that dwarfed not only Germany's tank output, but the expectations of America's own military planners. When William Knudsen and Charles Sorensen argued that mass production would be the true weapon, few could have predicted that the result would be tens of thousands of tanks delivered across oceans, deserts, and continents. Each was built for about $33,000 or 0 cents. A Tiger, by contrast, consumed on the order of 250,000, 300,000 Reichsmarks in wartime resources. A broad order of magnitude contrast in resource intensity, though currencies are not directly comparable. By the time Germany fielded a single Tiger, America had already produced scores of Shermans. The Sherman's legacy was not confined to World War II. After 1945, the tank continued to serve in 27 nations. In Korea, Shermans clashed with Soviet-built T-34/85S in the frozen mountains. There, the duel was closer to parity. U.S. records from the Korean War note engagements where Shermans and T-34S destroyed each other at nearly equal rates. The old tank, designed before America even entered the war, was still holding its own in the jet age. Forensic traces of its post-war service appear in Korean war logs. Sherman units engaged T-34/85 at ranges of 800–1,000 m. Losses on both sides significant. Vehicle reliability remained high. The reports read like echoes of earlier battles, a reminder that the Sherman had been built not for brilliance, but for endurance. Preservation cemented the legacy. Dozens of Shermans remain operational today, engines restored, tracks oiled, still able to rumble across fields for demonstrations. Bovington in England houses several, their interiors scarred but intact. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, a Liberty ship, carries one on its deck during commemorations, pairing two icons of American mass production. In Normandy, restored Shermans lead parades on anniversaries, symbols of liberation as much as weapons. General Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting after the war, said plainly, "Without the Sherman, we could not have won." Historian Stephen Ambrose echoed the sentiment decades later. It was not the best tank, but it was the right tank, and it was there everywhere. The words capture the paradox: mediocrity in design, greatness in purpose. Belton Y. Cooper, an ordnance officer whose memoir Death Traps became influential, painted the Sherman as a flawed machine that doomed crews. His accounts of burned-out tanks seared into popular memory, shaping the myth that America sent its men into death traps while the enemy rode superior machines. Yet Cooper's view, though heartfelt, lacked the industrial context. Shermans burned, yes, they also kept arriving. Faster than German guns could destroy them, for every burned hull, another rumbled forward. Cooper told the story of loss. History demands the story of victory. There was, however, another scenario. The contrast between German and American legacies is telling. Very few run today. Tiger 131 at Bobington is operational. Saumur has operated a Panther on occasion. By contrast, dozens of Shermans remain running worldwide. Museums display hulks, carefully restored but immobile, their engines too complex and fragile to revive. The Sherman, by contrast, still moves under its own power in reenactments and films. What Germany built as masterpieces turned into monuments. What America built as toys turned into survivors. The irony circles back to 1942. German officers had laughed at the Sherman's silhouette, its gasoline engine, its supposedly fragile armor. They wrote in journals that it would light up like a Ronson, that it was an unworthy opponent. By 1945, those same officers were retreating before battalions of Shermans in Normandy, surrounded by Soviet units driving Lend-Lease Shermans from the east. and surrendering in fields where Sherman stood watch. In memory, the Sherman became more than a tank. It became a symbol of the arsenal of democracy, proof that war was won not only by bravery in foxholes, but by riveters in Detroit and welders in Pittsburgh. Its silhouette embodied the union of industry and soldier, of factory and battlefield. It was a tank built not to impress engineers, but to win wars. Putadja numbers sealed its reputation. 49,000 built, 27 nations served, decades of combat endured. Against that arithmetic, German mockery rings hollow. The toy tank did not just fight, it outlasted, outproduced, and outlived its enemies. Children who climb onto Shermans in museum yards do not see mediocrity. They see the machine that carried armies across continents, that rolled through deserts, beaches, forests, and cities. They see the tank that stood on both sides of the world, marked with stars or hammers and sickles, always present. The legacy is not elegance, not invulnerability, not even tactical supremacy. The legacy is presence. The Sherman was always there, and because it was always there, the Allies advanced. The Axis retreated, and the war ended sooner than it might have. The German officers who laughed at it in 1942 could not have imagined that in 2025, the only tank still running from their war would bear the name Sherman.